world of medieval Italy, a place of strange echoes and fractured mirrors, is a land you probably think you know, but really don't. While your brain conjures images of powerful popes and artistic masters, it often forgets the brutal, bizarre, and utterly chaotic reality. Do you know that for a brief, bewildering time, the Pope had an army of ghosts? Or at least, that's what a terrified city believed they were. Or that an emperor could be excommunicated not once, not twice, but 4 times, basically making him the unholiest man on earth. These are the strange facts, the mysteries, and the historical head-scratchers that lie just beneath the surface of what you've been taught. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's go all the way back to the 5th century, to a moment when the lights were going out all over what was left of the Western Roman Empire. A new king, a new people were poised to take the stage in Italy. And they were not a people the Romans had ever seen before. The Roman Empire in the West was, by this point, a zombie. It was stumbling around on its last legs, propped up by treaties and the illusion of power. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was less a ruler and more a footnote. A teenage boy left holding the bag of a defunct empire. He was sent off to a villa with a nice pension, and that was that. The year was 476 AD. A German general named Odoacer had deposed the emperor, but he hadn't done so to end the empire. He had done it because he saw the system had already collapsed, and he wanted to be the last man standing in Italy. Odoacer wasn't a barbarian, at least not in the sense that he wanted to burn everything down. He was a professional soldier who had served Rome, but he represented a fundamental shift. He was a non-Roman, now controlling the Roman heartland. The Western Roman Empire was officially gone, but in Italy, life had to go on. Things were quiet for about 17 years, but the peace was fragile, built on the shifting sands of political convenience. A much larger force was gathering on the horizon, one that would change the face of Italy for centuries to come. The Ostrogoths, led by their king, Theodoric the Great. These people were not just a war band, they were a nation on the move, and they were coming to Italy with the blessing and perhaps the secret hope of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The Emperor, Zeno, saw Theodoric's Gothic kingdom as a threat, a problem he needed to solve. He brilliantly, or perhaps foolishly, depending on your view, decided to solve it by sending Theodoric to Italy to deal with Odoacer. Theodoric arrived in 489, a giant of a man with a flowing beard and an ambition to match. He and Odoacer fought a series of brutal, bloody campaigns. The decisive moment came with the siege of Ravenna, a city surrounded by marshes and almost impossible to assault. The siege lasted for 3 years, and in the end, Odoacer was forced to surrender. Theodoric promised to spare his life. They were even going to have a celebratory feast together. Sounds nice, right? Wrong. At the banquet, Theodoric raised his sword and, in front of a horrified crowd, killed Odoacer with his own hands. The message was clear. There was only one king in Italy now. Theodoric's rule was, for a time, a strange and remarkable golden age for the peninsula. He established the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, and unlike many of the Germanic rulers before him, he tried to rule through cooperation, not subjugation. He kept Roman administration in place, kept Roman law, and let the Roman Senate continue to meet. He even hired a Roman philosopher, Cassiodorus, to be his chief administrator. The Romans and the Goths lived side by side, but they were kept separate by a fundamental, unbreakable barrier: religion. The Goths were Arian Christians, a branch of Christianity that believed Jesus was not co-eternal with God the Father, but was created by him. The Romans were Nicene Christians, the kind that would become the basis for modern Catholicism. This difference wasn't just theological, it was cultural and political, a constant, low-level friction that simmered beneath the surface of Theodoric's reign. For a while, it worked. Theodoric repaired aqueducts, built magnificent churches, and even patronized the arts. He was, in many ways, the last great Roman emperor, even though he was a Goth. But the peace was a fragile illusion. As Theodoric grew older, his fear and suspicion grew too. He saw plots everywhere. He had his most trusted Roman advisors, like Boethius and Symmachus, executed. It was a paranoid frenzy that undid much of his work. When he died in 526, the kingdom he had built was a powder keg, ready to explode. And explode it did. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, Justinian Thrace, was a man with a singular obsession: to restore the old Roman Empire in all its glory. He saw Theodoric's death and the ensuing power struggle among the Goths as his perfect opportunity. He dispatched his greatest general, Belisarius, a man who had already recaptured North Africa from the Vandals, to Italy. What followed was a devastating 20-year-long conflict known as the Gothic War. This was not a quick campaign. It was a grinder, a war of sieges on counter-sieges. Belisarius took Rome in 536 and held it against an overwhelming Gothic army. The city was a ruin, its aqueducts cut, its people starving. The fighting was so fierce and the sieges so protracted that the very fabric of Italian life was torn apart. The countryside was depopulated, cities were emptied, and the once great Roman infrastructure crumbled, never to be fully restored. Historians still argue whether the Gothic War or the later Lombard invasion was more destructive to the fabric of Italy. But suffice it to say, the Gothic War left the peninsula a shell of its former self. Belisarius was eventually recalled to Constantinople, and the war dragged on until 554, with the second Byzantine general, Narses, finally breaking the last of the Gothic resistance. The Ostrogothic kingdom was gone, its people scattered, and Italy was once again under Roman rule. But this was a different kind of Rome, a distant one ruled from Constantinople. Italy was utterly exhausted, and the stage was set for the next wave of invaders. So, the Gothic War had left Italy in a state of utter ruin, its cities depopulated and its infrastructure shattered. The Byzantines had won, but what exactly had they won? A broken land, a hollow victory. The Byzantine Empire, ruled from Constantinople, was simply too far away and too overstretched to properly govern this ravaged peninsula. They imposed heavy taxes to pay for the endless wars and tried to re-establish a complex, bureaucratic Roman administration that nobody had the will or the means to follow. It was a short-lived, miserable peace. The Emperor Justinian, having spent a fortune to reunite the empire, now found himself with a massive and massively expensive new problem. The Byzantine presence was a handful of garrisons and a bunch of tax collectors, and you can probably guess which of those were more unpopular. But the real challenge, the true end of Italy's brief return to Roman rule, was still to come. Just a few years after the Gothic War ended, another Germanic people, the Lombards, were looking for a new home. They were a fierce, warlike people, originally from Scandinavia, who had migrated south through Central Europe. They had a reputation for ferocity, and, unlike the Goths, they weren't really interested in playing nice with the local Roman population. Their king, Alboin, had his sights set on Italy, a land that his scouts told him was ripe for the taking. The Byzantines had exhausted themselves fighting the Goths, and the local population was too tired and too poor to put up much of a fight. They entered Italy in 568, and it wasn't a slow migration. It was more like a tidal wave. They rolled over the Venetian plain and swept down the peninsula, meeting little organized resistance. The few Byzantine garrisons were often overwhelmed or simply retreated, leaving the civilian population to fend for themselves. This wasn't a war of conquest so much as a new people simply moving in and settling down. The Lombards, unlike the Ostrogoths before them, didn't set up a single unified kingdom right away. They were organized into a series of semi-independent duchies, each ruled by a powerful duke. This created a patchwork of Lombard-controlled territories, with Byzantine-held pockets squeezed in between. The north of Italy became Lombardia, a name that obviously stuck, with its capital at Pavia. Further south, two powerful duchies, Spoleto and Benevento, were carved out, which essentially became semi-independent states that were only nominally loyal to the king in the north. This extreme fragmentation was a defining characteristic of medieval Italy. It wasn't one country, but a mosaic of competing powers. You had Lombard duchies fighting Lombard duchies, all while the Byzantines clung to their coastal cities and a thin strip of land connecting Ravenna to Rome. This corridor was a vital lifeline for the Byzantine Empire, and it would become a flashpoint for centuries. The rise of the Lombards had an unexpected and profound effect on the single most important institution in Italy, the Papacy. Remember how the popes had been under the thumb of the Eastern Roman Emperor? Well, with the emperor's authority now a joke and the Lombards an ever-present threat, the popes found themselves with a huge power vacuum to fill. The popes, particularly figures like Gregory the Great, 590–604 AD, were forced to become not just spiritual leaders, but temporal ones as well. They had to take on the responsibilities of a ruler, negotiating with the Lombards for peace, organizing the defense of Rome, and even raising and feeding armies. Gregory, a former city prefect, was an administrative genius. He used the vast papal estates to feed the starving population of Rome, earning him the kind of loyalty that no emperor could command from a distance. He basically established the papacy as an independent political entity, something that had been unthinkable just a century before. This was a mainstream historical fact that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. The Lombards themselves, who were initially Arian Christians and viewed the Pope with suspicion, slowly began to convert to Nicene Christianity. This wasn't a sudden change. It was a gradual process that took over a century. A key figure in this conversion was Queen Theodelinda, a Bavarian princess who was Nicene Christian and who had a huge influence on her husband, King Agilulf. Their son was baptized Catholic, and slowly but surely, the Lombard elite began to follow suit. This conversion, however, didn't solve the core problem. The Lombards still wanted more land, and the richest prize was Rome and the surrounding area. The popes had a new enemy to worry about, one that was right on their doorstep. The papacy found itself in a truly desperate position. They couldn't rely on the distant Byzantine emperor for help, and the Lombards were a constant, nagging threat. They had to look for a new protector, a new patron. The logical choice was the rising power to the north, the Franks. The Franks, ruled by the Carolingian dynasty, were also Nicene Christians and had a deep reverence for the Pope. The Pope and the Frankish kings began a slow, careful dance of diplomacy. The Pope needed a military force to protect him from the Lombards, and the Frankish kings needed a religious authority to legitimize their rule. It was a perfect, mutually beneficial alliance in the making. The Pope, seeing the writing on the wall, decided to make a move. He sought to create a state of his own. The Papal States, as they would come to be known, were born out of this desperation. The popes now had a reason to exist as a political entity. The stage was set for the arrival of the big guy himself, the king who would forever change the relationship between the church and the state. And he was just getting started. The stage was set, and the main players were in place. The fragmented Lombard kingdom, a desperate and politically savvy papacy, and a rising Frankish power to the north. But before the big entrance, there was one more piece of the puzzle to be put into place. The Lombards, despite converting to Catholicism, were still a huge problem for the popes. The Lombard kings, particularly Aistulf and Desiderius, had a simple goal: to unite the entire peninsula under their rule. This meant taking Rome, which was a big no-no for the Pope. The popes, who had tasted a bit of independent power, weren't about to give it up. This created a new kind of geopolitical dance, a constant push and pull between a king who wanted to be king of all of Italy and a religious leader who needed to be his own temporal ruler to survive. Aistulf, the Lombard king, was particularly aggressive. He conquered the last remaining Byzantine outpost in northern Italy, the Exarchate of Ravenna. This territory, which included the city of Ravenna itself and a large chunk of land around it, was a major blow to Byzantine authority and a huge threat to the papacy. The Pope at the time, Stephen II, was a man of action, and he knew he couldn't sit around and wait for the Lombards to come knocking on Rome's gates. He had to do something drastic, something unprecedented. He decided to go to France himself to seek help. This was a massive undertaking for a pope, a journey across the Alps, a long and dangerous trip. He met with the Frankish king, Pepe the Short, and made a deal. The Pope would legitimize Pepin's new Carolingian dynasty, giving him the religious authority he needed, and in return, Pepin would protect the papacy and restore the lands taken by the Lombards. This was, in essence, the foundational moment of the alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kings, an alliance that would define the rest of the medieval period. Pepin kept his word. He led two military campaigns into Italy, easily defeating the Lombards. He didn't, however, restore the lands to the Byzantines. Instead, he gave the conquered territories, including the Exarchate of Ravenna and other Lombard lands, directly to the Pope. This gift, known as the Donation of Pepin in 756 AD, was the formal beginning of the Papal States. The Pope was now not just a spiritual leader, but a king, a territorial ruler with his own lands, armies, and subjects. This was a game changer. It created a unique and strange entity in the heart of Europe, a theocracy that was also a kingdom. It also meant that the Pope was now a player on the international stage, a kingmaker who could call upon the might of the Franks for help. But this also created a new kind of tension, one that would plague the region for centuries. The Lombards still existed, and they were still a threat. The Lombard kings, under Desiderius, made one last attempt to take back what they had lost. He was a savvy ruler, and he knew he couldn't fight the Franks and the Pope at the same time. He tried to use diplomacy, marrying his daughter to the new Frankish king, Charlemagne. But that plan blew up in his face when Charlemagne, for reasons that are still debated by historians, decided to divorce Desiderius's daughter after only a year. This was a huge slap in the face to Desiderius and a clear sign that the alliance was over. The Pope, Adrian III, was also worried about Desiderius's growing power and called upon Charlemagne for help. Charlemagne, a man of huge ambition and military genius, didn't hesitate. He marched a huge army over the Alps, besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia, and defeated Desiderius in 774. He didn't just win, he ended the Lombard kingdom. He deposed Desiderius and took the title King of the Lombards for himself. This was the end of Lombard rule in northern Italy, a reign that had lasted for over 200 years. So, the Lombards were gone, and Italy was once again under the rule of a single, powerful king. But this wasn't the end of the story. Charlemagne, for all his power, still had one last piece of the puzzle to put in place. The Pope, Leo III, was in a tough spot. He was politically weak, and some of his rivals in Rome were trying to have him removed from power. He was even physically attacked in the street. He fled to Charlemagne for help, and Charlemagne, ever the master of political theater, came to Rome to restore order. On Christmas Day in the year 800, as Charlemagne knelt in prayer in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This act, this moment, was the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a huge deal, a rebirth of the Roman Empire in the West, but with a twist. It was a Germanic king crowned by a pope. This new empire would become the dominant force in Europe for the next 1,000 years, and its relationship with the papacy would be the central drama of medieval history. But it was also a fake. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople was furious, as he was, in his mind, the only legitimate Roman emperor. And Charlemagne, for his part, was reportedly surprised by the coronation, which many historians think was a well-staged performance designed to give the Pope more power. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne was truly surprised, or if this was just a great piece of acting. Charlemagne's empire was a massive, sprawling thing, and it was hard to hold together. After he died, the empire was split among his grandsons, and Italy, once again, found itself in a state of chaos. This period, known as the Carolingian interregnum, was one of extreme fragmentation and political instability. The old Roman and Lombard structures had been swept away, and now there was a vacuum of power, and into that vacuum would step a whole host of new players, people who would change the face of Italy forever. The grand empire of Charlemagne had, much like the Roman one before it, proven to be too big, too sprawling, and too personal to a single man. When he passed away, it was divided up, and Italy found itself in a state of political anarchy. The central Carolingian authority simply melted away. The Frankish kings who ruled over the Italian portion were weak, and their power was more theoretical than real. This left a massive power vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. Into this void stepped a whole cast of ambitious local players. The old, centralized Roman and Lombard systems were gone, replaced by a new, more localized way of doing things. This was the dawn of a new era, one defined by feudalism and the rise of local power centers. Powerful local families and aristocrats who had once served the Carolingian kings began to assert their independence. They built castles, raised private armies, and started acting like kings in their own right. They essentially carved out their own little mini-kingdoms, controlling land, taxes, and justice. This was not a smooth process. It was a constant state of low-level conflict. These local lords were always fighting with each other over land, resources, and influence. This was the dark side of feudalism, a system that created 1,000 tiny tyrants, each one a law unto himself. These guys, for all their fancy titles, were basically glorified gang leaders, constantly jockeying for position and power. But something else was happening as well, something that would define the future of Italy. In the cities, a different kind of power was growing. The old Roman urban centers, which had been slowly decaying for centuries, began to experience a new kind of vitality. Merchants, craftsmen, and traders started to organize themselves. They formed guilds and associations to protect their interests and their trade routes. As their wealth and power grew, they started to demand more political autonomy from the local feudal lords and eventually from the kings and emperors. These cities were centers of commerce, not just military might, and they were the engines that would eventually drive a new kind of social and political structure. This period was a mess. Italy was in a constant state of flux. Remember that papacy that had just gained its own lands? Well, they were also in trouble. The Roman nobles had their own power plays going on, and the Pope became a pawn in their games. This was a dark time for the papacy, a period of scandal and political manipulation known as the pornocracy, a name that sounds way more fun than it actually was. When powerful Roman families like the Theophylacti controlled the papal office, the popes during this time were often just puppets, installed and removed at the whim of these powerful aristocratic clans. This era showed how fragile the papacy's new temporal power was without a strong external protector. The Holy Roman Emperor was still a thing, but the men who held the title in the late ninth and early 10th centuries were weak and ineffective, and they spent most of their time fighting with each other for control of the title. This state of political fragmentation created an opening for a new strongman ruler, a man who could unify the disparate parts of Italy and restore some semblance of order. His name was Otto Thiers, a German king of the Ottonian dynasty. Otto was a serious dude, a powerful warrior who had already established his authority in Germany. He saw the chaos in Italy as an opportunity, and after a long and brutal campaign, he marched into Italy and re-established order. In 962 AD, the Pope, desperate for a protector, crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor. This was a major turning point, a mainstream historical fact that essentially revived Charlemagne's empire and, more importantly, created a new, long-standing relationship between the German kings and the Italian peninsula. The Holy Roman Emperors would now, for the next several centuries, see themselves as the rightful rulers of Italy. This meant they would spend a ton of time, money, and men trying to enforce their authority. This created a major problem, a new fault line in Italian politics. You had the emperor, who saw himself as the ultimate authority, and you had the increasingly powerful local players, the nobles and the cities, who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The Holy Roman Emperors would repeatedly lead massive armies across the Alps to assert their control, only to see their authority melt away as soon as they left. It was a vicious cycle of invasion and resistance that would continue for centuries. It was like trying to herd cats, but the cats were all heavily armed and had their own fortified castles. The seeds of the future conflict between the emperors and the rising city-states were sown in this era of fragmentation and renewed imperial ambition, and the popes, caught in the middle, would find themselves constantly having to choose sides, a choice that would lead to one of the biggest and most dramatic showdowns in medieval history. The Carolingian interregnum and the subsequent arrival of the Ottonian emperors had firmly established a pattern that would define medieval Italy for centuries. A push and pull between a distant, powerful emperor and a host of increasingly autonomous local powers. It was a tug of war, and the rope was the Italian peninsula itself. While the emperors were busy trying to assert their authority, the local players were busy consolidating theirs. This was the era when the traditional feudal system, which had been imported from the Frankish north, began to evolve into something uniquely Italian. Instead of a single, all-powerful king at the top of a strict hierarchy, you had a kaleidoscope of competing interests, each with its own agenda. At the top of the social ladder were the great feudal lords. These guys, the dukes and marquesses of Tuscany, Spoleto, and Benevento, controlled vast swathes of the countryside. They built impressive castles on hilltops, used their private armies to enforce their will, and basically ran their territories like little kingdoms. They were powerful, but they were also isolated. Their power was tied to the land, and in Italy, the real action was happening elsewhere. As a sleepy listener, you can imagine these guys as being the lords of 1,000 quiet, beautiful valleys, but they were a world away from the hustle and bustle of the cities. They were more or less what you would expect from a traditional feudal system. But they were not the only game in town. The real innovation was happening in the cities. Remember how they had been slowly coming back to life? Well, by the 11th century, they were experiencing a full-blown economic and political renaissance. Trade with the Byzantine East and the Islamic world was booming, and the cities were becoming centers of commerce and finance. This new wealth created a new class of people: merchants, bankers, and skilled artisans. These people, who had the money and the manpower, wanted a say in how their cities were run. They didn't want to be ruled by some distant count or duke who was more interested in fighting over land than in protecting trade routes. They organized themselves into guilds and associations, and they started to demand more self-governance. It was like a new kind of city-state, and it was a direct challenge to the old feudal order. This was not a smooth process, to be clear. It was a messy, bloody, and often chaotic struggle. The cities would often fight their feudal overlords, besieging their castles and forcing them to give up their power. It was a classic case of the new money and new power clashing with the old. The rise of these communes, or city-states, was a truly fundamental change. They were not just economic centers, but political entities with their own laws, their own councils, and even their own armies. The Pope also had a lot of power here, though it was often indirect. He could play the various lords and cities off against each other. He could legitimize one ruler over another, or he could excommunicate a particularly troublesome one. The Papacy, which had been so weak during the pornocracy, was now becoming a major player on the world stage, an arbiter of not just religious, but also political authority. It was a complex web of alliances and rivalries, and it was constantly shifting. You had cities allied with other cities, dukes allied with popes, and everyone was trying to get ahead. The Byzantines, by the way, were still a presence, clinging to what was left of their territories in the south of Italy. But they were a fading power, a shadow of their former glory. The real power in the south was about to be taken over by a new and surprising player. The Saracens, as the Muslims of North Africa and Spain were known, were also a major force in the south, launching raids and even establishing a temporary emirate in Beirut. But the biggest change would come from a group of Norsemen from the north, a group that had carved out a powerful reputation as mercenaries. They were a bit like the freelance contractors of the medieval world, and they were about to show up in Italy and change everything. This fragmentation, this chaotic mix of city-states, feudal lords, popes, and even the remnants of Byzantine and Arab power, was the engine of change in Italy. It was a strange kind of laboratory for political and social experimentation, and while it was often brutal and violent, it was also the crucible that forged the unique character of Italy and set the stage for one of the most famous conflicts of the entire medieval period, one that would pit the popes against the emperors in an epic battle for power. Historians still argue whether this fragmentation was a source of strength or a weakness for the Italian peninsula in the long run. The stage was now set for the main event, The ultimate heavyweight bout of the medieval era, the Holy Roman Emperors versus the Italian city-states. The emperors, particularly those from the Ottonian and Salian dynasties, saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Roman Empire. They believed that Italy, including the Papal States, was part of their patrimony, their inherited land, and they weren't shy about enforcing that claim. For them, it was a matter of tradition, of law, and of honor. They would lead massive armies across the Alps. And if you can imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of moving an army of thousands of men, horses, and wagons through the treacherous mountain passes, you would understand just how serious they were. The emperor's constant attempts to assert control were not about a casual visit. They would stay for years, and their presence was a huge burden on the Italian populace. The Italian cities, however, had their own ideas about who should be in charge. They had tasted independence, and they liked it. They were getting rich from trade, and they had no interest in paying taxes to a distant German ruler. This created a fundamental conflict that would last for centuries. The emperors saw the cities as rebellious subjects, while the cities saw the emperors as foreign invaders. The cities, with their growing wealth, were able to build walls, raise militias, and hire professional soldiers. They were not to be trifled with. This conflict came to a head in the 12th century with the arrival of Frederick III, known as Frederick Barbarossa, or Red Beard. He was a man of immense charisma and military skill, a true emperor's emperor. He was determined to restore the power and prestige of the Holy Roman Empire. And he saw the independent-minded Italian cities as a direct challenge to his authority. He led no less than 6 military campaigns into Italy. He was not just trying to put down a few rebellions. He was trying to re-establish a medieval empire with a strong, centralized authority. And Italy was the key to that plan. His first few campaigns were successful. He defeated some of the more rebellious cities, and he even managed to get himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. But he underestimated the resolve of the Italian city-states. In 1167, the cities of northern Italy, led by Milan, formed a military alliance against him. They called themselves the Lombard League. This was a pivotal moment. It was not just a handful of cities fighting for their independence. It was a united front, a powerful alliance of wealthy, well-fortified communes that were willing to put aside their own rivalries to fight a common enemy. The Pope, seeing an opportunity to check the emperor's power, sided with the Lombard League, and the conflict became a three-way struggle between the cities, the Pope, and the Emperor. The struggle was a long, grinding war of attrition. Frederick Barbarossa, for all his military skill, was repeatedly stymied by the city's fortified walls and their ability to raise fresh troops. The decisive moment came in 1176 at the Battle of Legnano. It was a massive battle, and the imperial army was decisively defeated. This was a shocking loss for the emperor, a true humiliation. It was the first time that a European emperor had been defeated in open battle by a coalition of city militias. It proved that the old feudal order was dead, and that a new kind of power, a power based on commerce and civic loyalty, had emerged. Frederick Barbarossa was forced to negotiate. In 1183, he signed the Peace of Constance, a treaty that, while not a complete surrender, gave the cities of the Lombard League a huge amount of autonomy. They were allowed to govern themselves, to have their own laws and their own armies, so long as they paid a nominal tribute to the emperor. This was a huge victory for the cities and a clear sign that the political landscape of Italy had changed forever. The victory of the Lombard League also had a profound effect on the popes. They had now found a new ally against the emperors, the cities themselves. This alliance would become a key feature of future conflicts, a coalition of two powers who, for different reasons, wanted to keep the emperors out of Italy. For the cities, it was about preserving their independence. For the popes, it was about maintaining their temporal power and their control over the papal states. And for Frederick Barbarossa, it was the end of a long and bloody struggle. He had tried to put the genie of Italian independence back in the bottle, and he had failed. He died on crusade a few years later, but his legacy and the conflict he ignited would live on for centuries. The defeat of Frederick Barbarossa at Legnano was a defining moment, but it was far from the end of the conflict. The struggle between the Holy Roman Emperors and the Papacy, and by extension, the Italian cities, was just getting started. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, the line of German emperors that Frederick belonged to, was not about to give up on its claim to Italy, but they had a new strategy. Instead of brute force, they would try to win by a clever marriage. In 1186, Frederick's son, Henry VI, married Constance of Sicily, the heiress to the Norman kingdom in southern Italy. This was a massive geopolitical chess move. It meant that the Hohenstaufen dynasty would now control not only a large chunk of Germany, but also a powerful, wealthy kingdom in the south of Italy, a kingdom that was just a stone's throw from the Papal States. The Pope was now completely surrounded, a little boat in a sea of imperial power. When Henry VI died young, his infant son, Frederick II, was left as the heir to this sprawling empire. This was a big problem for the papacy. A child on the throne meant a power vacuum, and the Pope, Innocent III, saw an opportunity. He took Frederick under his wing, acting as his guardian and protector. He saw a chance to shape a new kind of emperor, one who would be more loyal to the papacy. But Innocent III was a truly powerful pope, a man who saw himself as the ultimate authority, with the right to crown and depose kings. And he was very, very good at his job. He used his authority to arbitrate disputes, to launch crusades, and to assert papal power across Europe. He was like a medieval CEO, running the entire continent as if it were his company. But the real drama came with the coming of age of Frederick II. He was an extraordinary figure, a man of immense intellect and ambition. Born and raised in Sicily, he spoke Arabic, Latin, Greek, and Italian. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, a falconry enthusiast, and a man who, frankly, had more in common with the enlightened rulers of the Renaissance than with the medieval kings of his time. He was known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. He was a true polymath, a man who built a magnificent court in Sicily that was a fusion of Norman, Byzantine, Islamic, and Roman cultures. But for all his brilliance, He was a massive headache for the popes. He was a king who was not afraid to challenge the papacy directly. The popes had put him on the throne, but he was not about to be their puppet. This created a new kind of conflict, a personal, ideological battle between a brilliant emperor and a series of popes who saw him as a threat to their power. The struggle was about two things: territory and authority. The popes wanted to keep control of their lands in central Italy, and they saw Frederick's control of both Germany and the south as a direct threat. They also believed that the Pope, as the representative of God on earth, had ultimate authority over all temporal rulers, including the emperor. Frederick, on the other hand, saw himself as the rightful heir to the Roman emperors, a ruler who derived his power directly from God, not from the Pope. This was a fundamental disagreement, and it led to a long, vicious, and very public showdown. The popes excommunicated Frederick not once, not twice, but 4 times. He was basically the bad boy of medieval Europe, constantly being told he was going to hell. This was not a small thing, as it meant his subjects were technically released from their loyalty to him. But Frederick was a charismatic guy, and he didn't care. He would march his armies into Italy, fight the papal forces, and generally ignore the Pope's authority. He was even excommunicated for going on a crusade without the Pope's permission. It was a classic "I told you so" moment for the papacy when he failed. Just kidding. He actually succeeded, winning control of Jerusalem through negotiation rather than battle, which only annoyed the Pope even more. The conflict between Frederick II and the popes was a defining moment in the history of the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. It was the final, all-out war between the two greatest powers of the medieval world. And for all of Frederick's brilliance, he ultimately failed to create a unified, centralized empire. The Italian cities, remember them, were a constant thorn in his side. They formed a new Lombard League to fight him, and they proved to be just as resilient as they had been against his grandfather. When Frederick died in 1250, his dynasty essentially collapsed. The popes had won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The constant wars had left Italy in a state of exhaustion, and they had created a new, powerful set of factions that would continue to fight each other long after the emperor was gone. These factions were known by two names that would become synonymous with political division in Italy for centuries to come. The grand struggle between the Holy Roman Emperors and the popes had a fascinating and often bloody side effect. It created two warring factions that would tear Italy apart for centuries. These weren't just political parties. They were widespread social movements that divided families, towns, and cities. On one side were the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. The name itself is said to come from the Hohenstaufen rallying cry, Weiblingen, which was the name of a Hohenstaufen castle in Germany. Ghibelline support was strongest among the feudal aristocracy, the old noble families whose power was tied to the land and who saw the emperor as the ultimate authority. For them, a strong emperor meant a stable order and a check on the growing power of the cities. They were the conservatives of their time, believing in a traditional hierarchy with a king at the top. On the other side were the Guelphs, who supported the Pope. Their name is a corruption of the German name Welf, the name of a powerful family that was a long-time rival of the Hohenstaufen. Guelph support was strongest among the wealthy merchant class and the new urban elite. They saw the Pope as a natural ally against the Emperor, a figure who could help them maintain their independence and keep the distant, heavy-handed imperial authority at bay. They were the progressive, pro-autonomy faction, a direct reflection of the rising power of the city-states. The rivalry between Guelphs and Ghibellines wasn't just a north-south divide. It was a local, street-level conflict that played out in every Italian city. One city would be staunchly Guelph, while its neighbor would be just as fiercely Ghibelline. The famous dower houses of Bologna, Florence, and Siena were often built by these rival families, fortified homes that were ready for a fight at a moment's notice. In Florence, for example, the Guelphs and Ghibellines fought a series of brutal civil wars that led to the exile of the losing faction. These conflicts were incredibly personal. If your family was Ghibelline, you were a Ghibelline, and you were expected to fight your Guelph neighbors. It was a world where a misplaced word or a wrong-colored banner could get you killed. Even the great poet Dante Alighieri was a Guelph, and his exile from Florence was a direct result of the factional fighting. The conflict wasn't just about political loyalty, it was also about money and power. The Guelph cities, being trade-focused, were often richer and more powerful than their Ghibelline rivals. They used their wealth to fund armies and to build alliances, often with the support of the Pope. The Ghibellines, on the other hand, relied on military strength and the promise of imperial support, which was often slow to arrive and didn't last very long once the emperor left. The popes, for their part, were masters of this game. They would excommunicate emperors and Ghibelline leaders, and they would grant special privileges to the Guelph cities. It was a brilliant strategy that allowed them to check the power of the emperors without having to raise a massive army of their own. But with Frederick II gone, the Ghibellines lost their strongest protector. The papacy, however, was not about to rest. They were worried about the remaining Hohenstaufen influence in southern Italy, and they saw an opportunity to get rid of them once and for all. They invited a new foreign power into the mix, the Angevins, a French dynasty led by Charles V of Anjou, the brother of the French king. The Pope, Urban IV, offered Charles the crown of Sicily and Naples in exchange for his military help. Charles, a man with a huge appetite for power, didn't hesitate. He led a French army into Italy, decisively defeated the last of the Hohenstaufen claimants, and took control of southern Italy. It was a huge victory for the papacy and the Guelphs, but it also introduced a new and very ambitious player into the Italian political scene. The popes had a new protector, but they had also created a new kind of problem. The Angevins were not a subtle bunch. They were French, and they ruled with a heavy hand, imposing high taxes and installing French officials in all the key positions. The Sicilian people, who had enjoyed a period of relative prosperity and cultural richness under the Hohenstaufen, quickly grew to resent their new masters. The stage was set for a major rebellion, a bloody and brutal uprising that would change the political map of Italy and the entire Mediterranean. It would be a classic case of a new boss being worse than the old boss, and it would culminate in a moment of extreme violence that is still remembered today. The Angevins had arrived in southern Italy with the Papacy's blessing, but their rule quickly became a nightmare for the local population. Charles of Anjou, a true Frenchman, treated the kingdom of Sicily and Naples not as a new home, but as a conquered land. He raised taxes to astronomical levels to pay for his constant wars and his grand ambitions, which included conquering Constantinople. He installed French officials in every position of power, from local administrators to high-ranking military commanders. The people of Sicily, who had lived for a century under the relatively tolerant and culturally rich rule of the Normans and Hohenstaufen, suddenly found themselves second-class citizens in their own country. The resentment was deep and festering, a quiet anger that was just waiting for a spark to ignite it. That spark came on Easter Monday in the year 1282 at a church just outside Palermo. The story, which has been passed down for centuries, is that a French sergeant was being overly familiar with a young Sicilian woman. The Sicilians, already at their breaking point, erupted in a fury. The cry, "Death to the French," rang out, and within a few minutes, the whole city was in a bloody, brutal revolt. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the entire island. It was a massive, popular uprising, a true case of the people taking back their land. The event became known as the Sicilian Vespers, named after the evening church service where the rebellion began. The name itself is a grim reminder of the moment that everything went horribly wrong for the French. The rebellion was incredibly violent. The Sicilians, fueled by years of pent-up rage, showed no mercy. The French, caught completely off guard, were slaughtered wherever they were found. No French person was spared, no matter their age or social standing. It was a complete and total cleansing of the island. Charles of Anjou, who was busy planning his next conquest, was stunned. He had lost an entire kingdom and a huge chunk of his army in a single day. He immediately launched a counterattack, but it was too little, too late. The Sicilians, knowing they couldn't stand alone against the Angevin military machine, had reached out to a new protector, Peter III of Aragon, the son-in-law of the last Hohenstaufen king. Peter, who had a claim to the throne through his wife, immediately sailed to Sicily and was proclaimed king. This was a huge geopolitical shift. The kingdom of Sicily was now under the rule of the House of Aragon, and the kingdom of Naples remained under the control of the Angevins. The two halves of what had once been a single kingdom were now split, and they would remain separated for centuries. This event was a major turning point, a clear demonstration that the papacy's power to crown and depose kings could have unintended and very bloody consequences. The popes had invited the Angevins into Italy to get rid of the Hohenstaufen, but they had ended up creating a new, more complicated problem, one that involved a new foreign power. The Sicilian Vespers and the subsequent war between the Angevins and the Aragonese had a ripple effect across all of Italy. The Guelph and Ghibelline conflict, which had been simmering for a while, was reignited with a new ferocity. The Aragonese were Ghibelline, and the Angevins were staunchly Guelph. So, the local wars that were already happening were now part of a larger international conflict. The cities of Italy were once again forced to choose sides, and the fighting was relentless. For example, the city of Genoa, which was a major naval power, sided with the Aragonese and fought a long and bloody war with the city of Pisa, which was on the side of the Angevins. This kind of local level fighting, now linked to a larger international struggle, was a defining characteristic of this era. The popes, meanwhile, were having their own problems. They had won the war against the emperors, but they had also angered the powerful kings of Europe. The French kings, in particular, were not happy with the pope's meddling, and they saw an opportunity to bring the papacy under their control. In 1309, the Pope moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in what is now southern France. The Avignon papacy was a period of over 60 years where the popes were essentially puppets of the French crown. This was a huge humiliation for the papacy, a body that had just won a century-long struggle for independence. It also created a huge problem in Rome, where the city, now without the Pope, fell into a state of chaos. The popes were in a foreign land, and the Romans were left to their own devices, which, as you can probably guess, led to a lot of fighting. Historians still argue whether the popes left Rome because they were truly under the influence of the French king, or if they just wanted to get away from the messy politics of Rome. The papacy's sojourn in Avignon was a disaster for Rome and a humiliation for the Church. For over 60 years, 7 popes ruled from this French city, a period that the Italian poet Petrarch famously called the Babylonian captivity. The Romans were furious. Without the Pope, the city fell into a state of political and economic decay. The great Roman monuments crumbled, and rival noble families, like the Colonna and the Orsini, turned the streets into their own private battlefields. It was a chaotic, lawless time. A few would-be saviors tried to restore order, most famously a populist leader named Cola di Rienzo, who, in 1347, declared himself tribune of the people and tried to revive the Roman Republic. He was briefly successful, a kind of celebrity politician, but his rule was a flash in the pan. The nobles returned, and he was eventually murdered by a mob. The popes, meanwhile, were living a life of luxury in Avignon, but they were also under the thumb of the French king, and their absence from Italy created a huge void of authority. This void was a huge problem for the Church and for Europe as a whole. The people, who had grown used to the Pope being in Rome, saw him as a French puppet. This created a crisis of faith and a growing movement to bring the papacy back to its rightful home. Finally, in 1377, Pope Gregory XVIII, convinced by the pleas of an Italian mystic named Catherine of Siena, decided to return to Rome. It was a huge moment, a homecoming that was supposed to restore order and unity, but it didn't. Gregory XVIII died shortly after his return, and the cardinals, under pressure from a Roman mob that wanted an Italian pope, elected an Italian cardinal, Urban VI. Urban, however, proved to be a hot-headed, tyrannical ruler, and the French cardinals, who felt they had been bullied into electing him, went back to Avignon and elected their own pope, Clement VII. And just like that, there were two popes. The Catholic Church was now split down the middle, a schism that would last for almost 40 years. This event, known as the Western Schism, 1378-1417, was a profound crisis for Europe. It was an open scholarly debate. Was it an open schism or two popes? All of Europe was forced to choose a side. And the political alliances of the day were a huge factor. The French and their allies supported the Avignon Pope, and the English, the Holy Roman Emperor, and most of the Italian city-states supported the Roman Pope. The schism was a disaster for the papacy. The popes in Rome and Avignon spent their time excommunicating each other and calling each other heretics. This undermined the authority of the Church and created a huge amount of confusion and cynicism. It also meant that the popes were too busy fighting each other to meddle in Italian politics. This was a huge opportunity for the city-states, who were now free to expand their territories and consolidate their power without fear of papal interference. They took full advantage of the situation. And the period of the Western Schism was a time of huge growth and expansion for many of the great Italian communes. But the schism had to end eventually. A series of councils were called to try and resolve the issue, and at the Council of Constance, 1414-1418, they finally did. They deposed both popes and elected a new one, Pope Martin V, who was from a powerful Roman family, the Colonna. He was, as you can imagine, a very popular choice in Rome. He re-established the papacy in Rome, but the crisis had left a permanent mark. The papacy's authority had been severely weakened, and it would never again be able to command the same kind of moral and political authority it had in the past. It would, however, now find itself in a new role. Instead of being a kingmaker and an arbiter of European politics, it would become a player in a new game. The popes, now safely back in Rome, had a new set of problems. The papal states were a mess, a collection of unruly towns and petty lords that had been left to their own devices for decades. The popes would now have to spend their time and their money trying to re-establish their authority over their own lands. This meant they would have to act like the other Italian rulers, raising armies, making alliances, and fighting wars. This was a huge shift from the old days, and it would lead to a new kind of papacy, one that was just as concerned with its own temporal power as it was with its spiritual authority. This was a new era, one that was all about power, art, and ambition. And it would all come to a head in a city that had been quietly building its own empire, while the rest of Italy was busy fighting, while the popes were busy dealing with the Great Schism, and the Holy Roman Emperors were mostly a distant memory. A city in northern Italy was quietly becoming the most influential place on the entire peninsula. Florence was not a major military power like Milan or Venice, but it had something else. Money. A lot of it. The Florentines were masters of banking, textiles, and commerce. They were the financial heart of Europe, and their gold coin, the florin, was the most trusted currency on the continent. This immense wealth didn't just stay in the pockets of the merchants. It was used to fund a new kind of society, one that valued art, learning, and beauty. This was the beginning of the Renaissance, a rebirth of classical ideas and a new way of looking at the world. And at the heart of this new society was a single family, the Medici. The Medici were not of the old nobility. They were a family of bankers who, through a combination of ruthless ambition, political savvy, and immense wealth, came to control Florence from behind the scenes. They were the puppet masters, the true power behind the illusion of a Florentine republic. It all started with Giovanni di Pici de' Medici, who turned the family bank into the most powerful financial institution in Europe. But the real star was his son, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was a quiet, unassuming man who was a genius at politics. He never held a formal office, but he used his wealth and influence to place his friends and allies in all the key positions. He was a master of patronage, commissioning great works of art and architecture from artists like Brunelleschi and Donatello. He was, in a sense, the man who paid for the Renaissance. He was also a cunning politician who knew when to be generous and when to be ruthless. He was exiled from Florence for a time, but he was so essential to the city's economy that the Florentines were forced to beg him to come back. Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, was even more brilliant. Known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he was the true embodiment of the Renaissance ideal. He was a poet, an artist, a philosopher, and a master politician. He ruled Florence with a light hand, using his charm and his patronage to keep the peace and to make the city the cultural capital of Europe. He was a patron of the likes of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Sandro Botticelli. He famously brought the young Michelangelo into his household and treated him like a son. He was a diplomat who was able to maintain a delicate balance of power among the various Italian city-states. It was a constant juggling act, and he was a master juggler. He famously said that the stability of Italy depended on a balance of power, and he worked tirelessly to keep the peace. When he died in 1492, his death was seen as a sign of bad things to come. And they were. The fragile peace that he had maintained would not last. The Medici, however, were not without their enemies. A rival banking family, the Papacy, felt they were being frozen out of power. They conspired with the Pope and some other rivals to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother, Giuliano. The plot came to a head on Easter Sunday in 1478 during a church service. Giuliano was murdered, but Lorenzo, with the help of his friends, fought off his attackers and managed to escape. The Papacy conspiracy was a disaster for the conspirators. The Florentine people, who loved the Medici, turned on the conspirators and had them brutally killed. The Pope, who was involved in the plot, was furious and excommunicated the entire city of Florence. It was a dramatic moment, a true life thriller that showed how intertwined politics, religion, and art were in Renaissance Italy. The rise of the Medici and the Florentine Renaissance was a new kind of power, a power based not on feudal landholdings or military might, but on wealth, intelligence, and cultural patronage. It was a clear sign that the old medieval world was gone forever. The Papacy, which was still trying to recover from the schism, was now a major political player in Italy. But it was just one of many. A new era of Italian history had begun, an era of political intrigue, art, and war. But while Florence was busy being beautiful, A new kind of power was rising on the coasts, a power that was all about trade, money, and war. While Florence was busy with its art and its banking, two other Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa, were creating a different kind of empire, one based not on land, but on the sea. They were the great maritime republics, the undisputed masters of Mediterranean trade. They were rivals in every sense of the word, constantly fighting each other for control of trade routes, colonies, and influence. Their rivalry was so fierce that it defined a huge chunk of Italian medieval history, a series of brutal wars that were fought not on battlefields, but on the open water. Venice, a city built on a swampy lagoon, was a marvel of human ingenuity. It was a city without a land-based kingdom, a place that had to look outward to survive. The Venetians were masterful sailors and shrewd merchants, and they built an incredible trading empire that stretched from the Byzantine Empire to Egypt and beyond. They were the great middlemen of the medieval world, bringing spices, silks, and other luxury goods from the East to the European markets. They had a unique political system, a kind of aristocratic republic ruled by a powerful council and an elected doge, who was more a figurehead than a real ruler. The Venetians were incredibly disciplined and focused on the bottom line. For them, every war, every alliance, every political move was about one thing: profit. Their control of trade routes to the east was a huge source of their power, and they used their navy, which was the largest and most powerful in the Mediterranean, to protect their interests and to intimidate their rivals. They famously helped the Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade, but they did so only after they had secured a deal to have the Crusaders sack their greatest rival, the city of Constantinople. This was a cold, calculated move, a classic Venetian act that showed just how ruthless they were. Genoa, on the other hand, was a city of rugged sailors and fierce fighters. It was a rival to Venice in every way, and its empire was built on a series of colonies and trading posts that stretched from the Black Sea to Spain. The Genoese were the great explorers and colonizers of their time, and they were always looking for new markets and new opportunities. They were a republic like Venice, but their politics were far more volatile. They were constantly fighting among themselves, with rival noble families and merchant guilds vying for power. This internal strife was often a weakness, but it also made them incredibly resilient. They were a city of individualists, a place where a single family could rise to immense power and then fall just as quickly. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa was legendary, and it led to a series of long, bloody wars that are known as the Venetian-Genoese Wars. The fighting was brutal and decisive, with entire fleets being destroyed in a single battle. The most famous of these conflicts was the War of Chioggia, 1378-1381, which was fought for control of the Adriatic Sea. The Genoese, led by a brilliant admiral, had managed to blockade the Venetian lagoon, and it looked like Venice was doomed. But the Venetians, in a last-ditch effort, managed to break the blockade and defeat the Genoese fleet. It was a huge victory for Venice, and it marked the beginning of Genoa's decline as a major naval power. The rise of these two maritime republics was a clear sign that the political landscape of Italy was changing. Power was no longer just about land and feudal titles. It was about money, trade, and naval power. These cities were a new kind of state, a state that was focused on profit and commerce. They were the forerunners of the great trading empires of the early modern world. And while they were busy fighting each other, the rest of Italy was busy with its own problems. A new kind of warfare that was about to take hold and change the way wars were fought forever. The old citizen militias that had defeated Frederick Barbarossa were becoming a thing of the past. A new kind of soldier was on the rise, and he was for sale to the highest bidder. And that, my friends, is a truly terrifying thought. As the great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa were fighting for control of the seas, a new kind of power was rising on the Italian mainland. This was a power based not on a citizen militia or a feudal lord's army, but on a group of professional soldiers who were for hire to the highest bidder. These were the condottieri, or mercenary captains, and their rise changed the nature of warfare in Italy forever. The old citizen militias, which had been so effective against Frederick Barbarossa, were becoming obsolete. They were part-time soldiers who were not well-trained or well-equipped, and the constant fighting between the city-states required a new kind of army. The condottieri were a perfect solution. They were professional soldiers who had learned their trade on the battlefields of Europe. They came from all over, from Germany, Switzerland, England, and Spain, and they were led by charismatic and often ruthless captains. They were organized into companies of soldiers, and they would sell their services to whichever city-state had the most money. They were, in a sense, the freelance contractors of the medieval world, and they were a huge business. The cities would sign contracts, or condotti, with the captains, and the captains would, in turn, provide them with an army. This was a new way of doing business, and it was a huge change from the old feudal system where a lord's army was made up of his loyal vassals. The condottieri were not loyal to any city. They were loyal to their contract and to their paycheck. The rise of the condottieri had a huge impact on Italian politics. Wars became less about ideological conflicts and more about money. A city-state could buy an army, and it could win a war without having to risk its own citizens. This had a very interesting side effect. Wars became less bloody. The condottieri were not interested in slaughtering each other. They were professionals, and their goal was to win a battle with as little damage as possible to their own men, who were, after all, their livelihood. They would often fight battles with very few casualties, and they would often just capture the enemy commander and ransom him for a huge amount of money. It was a kind of gentleman's warfare, a very different kind of fighting from the brutal, no-holds-barred wars of the past. It was also a very expensive way to fight, and it meant that only the richest city-states could afford to play. The rights of the condottieri, therefore, meant that the rich got richer, and the poor got left behind. But the condottieri were also a huge source of instability. They were only loyal to money, and they could easily switch sides if a better offer came along. They were also a threat to the very cities that hired them. A successful condottieri captain could easily decide that he liked a city so much that he wanted to be its ruler. This happened more than once, and it led to the rise of a new kind of ruler, the signore, or lord. These were not old feudal lords. They were new men who had come to power through their military skill and their political ambition. They often ruled with an iron fist, but they also brought a kind of stability to the cities that they ruled. They would often become patrons of the arts and architecture, and they would turn the cities that they ruled into grand and beautiful places. One of the most famous of these condottieri captains was Francesco Sforza, who, through a combination of military skill and political savvy, took control of the city of Milan and founded a new dynasty. He was a classic example of a condottieri who rose to the top. The rise of the condottieri and the signori was a clear sign that the political landscape of Italy was changing again. The old days of the independent city-state, ruled by a council of merchants and bankers, were coming to an end. A new era of centralized authoritarian rule was beginning. And while some cities, like Florence and Venice, managed to hold on to their republican ideals, many others succumbed to the new kind of ruler. This new kind of political structure would be tested by a series of devastating conflicts that would see foreign powers, for the first time in centuries, come to dominate the Italian peninsula. The rise of the condottieri and the signori marked a huge shift in Italian politics, but some cities still clung to their republican traditions. While Florence and Venice were the big names, two other cities in Tuscany, Siena and Pisa, had their own unique and often overlooked stories. They were not as powerful as their big sister Florence, but they were just as fiercely independent and just as determined to make their mark on the world. Their histories are a testament to the fact that even in a region dominated by a few major powers, a city with enough money, ambition, and stubbornness could carve out its own destiny. Siena, for example, was a city of bankers and wool merchants, and it was, in many ways, the great rival of Florence. The two cities were a classic example of a sibling rivalry that often turned violent. Siena was staunchly Ghibelline, and Florence was just as fiercely Guelph. And the two cities fought a series of brutal wars that defined their relationship for centuries. The most famous of these conflicts was the Battle of Montaperti in 1260. The Florentine army, which was much larger and more powerful, was marching on Siena, and it looked like the Sienese were doomed. But the Sienese, with the help of a small German contingent and a lot of cunning, managed to pull off a stunning victory. The battle was a bloodbath, and it was a huge blow to Florentine pride. It was a famous victory that the Sienese would remember for centuries, and it showed that even the little guy could win if he was clever enough. Siena, however, was also a city of extreme political volatility. The government was constantly changing, and the city was plagued by factionalism and internal strife. It was a place of great art, with masters like Duccio and Simone Martini, creating masterpieces that rivaled those of Florence. But it was also a place of political chaos. Siena's unique political system, with its numerous councils and committees, was a model of civic participation. but it was also a recipe for gridlock and instability. Pisa, on the other hand, was a great maritime republic, a rival to Genoa and Venice, and a major player in the Mediterranean. The city, located on the Arno River, had a powerful navy and a huge trading empire that stretched from Spain to the Levant. The Pisans were major participants in the Crusades, and they used their military and naval power to establish colonies and trading posts all over the Mediterranean. The city's wealth was on full display in its magnificent cathedral square, with its famous baptistry and the iconic Leaning Tower, a testament to the city's ambition and its engineering hubris. But Pisa's power was not to last. The city's biggest rival was Genoa, and the two cities fought a series of long and brutal wars for control of Corsica and Sardinia. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Meloria in 1284. The Genoese fleet, which was much larger and better organized, decisively defeated the Pisan navy. It was a devastating loss for Pisa, and it marked the beginning of its decline. The city's trading empire crumbled, and it was eventually conquered by its old rival, Florence, in 1406. It was a sad end for a once proud republic, a reminder that even the most powerful cities could fall. The stories of Siena and Pisa are important because they show that Italy was not a monolith. It was a region of 1,000 different stories, of 1,000 different cities, each with its own unique character and its own unique history. They were a reminder that even in a world dominated by big powers, a city could still, for a time at least, be a star. These two cities, with their unique political systems, their rivalries, and their magnificent art, were a microcosm of the larger Italian story, a story of political fragmentation, of civic pride, and of a constant struggle for power and survival. And that story was about to get a whole lot more complicated as the French and Spanish, for the first time in centuries, were about to come knocking on Italy's door. This would begin a new era of conflict, a series of devastating wars that would make the old Guelph Ghibellini conflicts look like a children's game. The Italian peninsula had, for centuries, been a chaotic mess of competing city-states, popes, and a distant, meddling emperor. But the late 15th century saw a new kind of threat emerge, one that was far bigger and more organized than anything the Italians had faced before. The rising, centralized monarchies of France and Spain were now unified, wealthy, and powerful, and they were looking beyond their borders for new lands and new glory. Italy, with its immense wealth, its political fragmentation, and its magnificent art, was the most tempting prize in Europe. The stage was set for a new series of devastating conflicts. The Italian Wars, 1494-1559, which would see the peninsula become a battlefield for foreign powers, and would, for the first time, make Italy a prize to be won, not a player in its own right. The first act of this new drama began in 1494, when the French king, Charles VIII, led a massive army into Italy to press his claim to the Kingdom of Naples. The claim was flimsy, based on a centuries-old Angevin inheritance, but the Italian princes were too busy fighting each other to mount a unified defense. Charles V marched his army straight through the peninsula, meeting little resistance. He was hailed as a liberator in some cities and a tyrant in others. His march, however, was a rude awakening for the Italians. They had been so focused on their own internal rivalries that they had completely underestimated the power of the new European monarchies. The ease with which a foreign army could march through the peninsula was a shocking revelation. The French invasion set off a chain reaction of alliances, betrayals, and counter-invasions. The Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Venice, Milan, and even Spain all got involved. It was a chaotic, confusing time, a true free-for-all where alliances shifted at a moment's notice. The Spanish king, Ferdinand II of Aragon, who also had a claim to the Kingdom of Naples, sent his own army into Italy. The two great powers, France and Spain, now began to fight over Italy as if it were a chessboard, with the Italian cities as the pawns. The Italians, for their part, were not just passive victims. They would often hire foreign armies to fight their battles, but this only made things worse. It was like hiring two different teams of plumbers to fix your leaky sink. They just ended up flooding the house. The Italian wars were a brutal contrast to the gentlemanly wars of the condottieri. This was a war of total destruction, with sieges, massacres, and the widespread use of new technologies like cannons and gunpowder. It was a sign that the old medieval ways of fighting were gone forever. The French and Spanish armies, with their professional soldiers and their new weapons, were a force to be reckoned with. The Italians, with their reliance on condottieri and their fragmented politics, were simply no match. But the wars were also a time of political intrigue and a new kind of power politics. The popes, in particular, became masters of this new game. They would constantly shift their alliances, playing France and Spain against each other to try and maintain their own power. This was an age of ruthless, ambitious popes, men like Alexander VI, who would use any means necessary to secure power for themselves and their families. This was a far cry from the great popes of the past, who had fought for spiritual authority. These were men who were more concerned with worldly power, with building kingdoms and securing their family's place in history. And they would find a willing partner in the powerful Duchy of Milan, which was at the center of the conflict. The Duchy of Milan was a rich and powerful state, and its position at the crossroads of Europe made it a prime target for foreign powers. It had a long history of being ruled by a series of powerful and often ruthless rulers. The Visconti and the Sforza families, in particular, were masters of political intrigue, and they were experts at playing the various European powers against each other. But even they would not be able to withstand the new kind of warfare that was about to descend upon them. The Italian wars were a turning point, a final act in the long, chaotic, and beautiful story of medieval Italy. The era of the independent city-state was coming to an end, and a new era of foreign domination was about to begin. The Duchy of Milan, a rich and powerful state strategically located at the crossroads of Europe, was a prime target for the ambitions of foreign powers. But it was also home to a succession of incredibly cunning and ruthless rulers. For centuries, the city was dominated by the Visconti family, a line of ruthless tyrants who ruled with an iron fist. They were masters of political intrigue, and they used their immense wealth and military power to expand their territory and to dominate their neighbors. They were patrons of the arts and architecture, but they were also known for their brutality and their political assassinations. The most famous of them, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, was a true Renaissance despot, a man who, in a classic mainstream historical fact, built a vast state that, for a brief time, was the most powerful in all of Italy. But the Visconti line eventually died out, and the city was plunged into a new period of chaos. Into this chaos stepped a new kind of ruler, the condottieri captain Francesco Sforza. Sforza was not from an old noble family. He was the son of a successful mercenary captain, and he had learned his trade on the battlefield. He was a brilliant military strategist and a cunning politician, and he used his skills to rise to the top. He served the Visconti family as a commander, and he was so successful that he eventually married the last Visconti heir's daughter. When the last Visconti ruler died, Sforza used his military power and his political connections to seize control of the city. He was, in a sense, the ultimate Renaissance self-made man. He had started with nothing, and he had built a dynasty. He was, however, not a universally popular ruler. The Milanese, who had enjoyed a brief period of republican rule after the last Visconti's death, were not happy about being ruled by a mercenary captain. But Sforza was a smart guy. He was a master of public relations. He hired the best artists and architects to build new churches and palaces, and he created a court that was a center of learning and culture. He ruled with a firm hand, but he also brought a new kind of stability to the city, and he was able to protect it from the ambitions of its more powerful neighbors. The rise of the Sforza family was a classic example of the new kind of political structure that was emerging in Italy. The old days of the independent city-state, ruled by a council of merchants and bankers, were a thing of the past. A new era of centralized authoritarian rule was beginning, and the Sforza family were masters of this new game. But their rule would be short-lived. The Italian wars, which had just begun, would make Milan a prime target for the French and Spanish, and the Sforza family, for all their cunning and ambition, would not be able to withstand the onslaught. Milan would become a battleground, a city that was constantly being fought over, and its beautiful court would become a place of intrigue and betrayal. The Sforza family would be overthrown, and the city would fall under the control of a foreign power. The story of the Visconti and Sforza families is a microcosm of the larger Italian story. It's a story of ambition, of power, of art, and of betrayal. It's a story of how the old feudal order was giving way to a new kind of political structure, one that was based on money, on military power, and on a new kind of ruthlessness. It's a story that shows that even in a region of so many beautiful things, the dark side of human nature was always lurking just beneath the surface. And nowhere was that darker side more on display than in the papacy itself. The popes, who had just recovered from the Great Schism, were now acting more like the Italian princes than as spiritual leaders, and they were about to give the world a new and terrifying kind of ruler, one who would make the old despots look like choir boys. The papacy, which had just survived the Great Schism and the Avignon exile, was now a new kind of power. It was no longer just a spiritual authority, but a temporal one, a major player in the complicated game of Italian politics. The popes, however, were not immune to the same kind of worldly ambition that plagued the other Italian rulers. And nowhere was this more on display than in the infamous Borgia family. The Borgias were a Spanish family, but they came to dominate the Papal States in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. They were a family of ruthless ambition, and they were not afraid to use any means, including assassination, blackmail, and political marriage, to get what they wanted. The patriarch of the family, Rodrigo Borgia, became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He was not a spiritual man. He was a man of immense charm and intelligence, but he was also a man who was obsessed with power and with raising his family's status. He was, in essence, a Renaissance prince who just happened to be Pope. He had a number of children, a major scandal for the time, and he used his position to get them into positions of power. His son, Cesare Borgia, was a true Renaissance man, a brilliant military commander, and a cunning politician who was the model for Machiavelli's famous work, The Prince. Cesare was a force of nature. He was a ruthless, ambitious man who was determined to create a Borgia kingdom in central Italy. He used the papal army to conquer a series of small, unruly states in the Papal States, and he did so with a level of brutality that shocked even the most cynical of his contemporaries. He was a masterful military strategist and a cunning diplomat, and he was able to use the chaos of the Italian wars to his advantage. He was, in a sense, a new kind of ruler, a man who was not afraid to use terror and violence to achieve his goals. But Cesare's ambition was not without limits. His power was tied to his father's, and when Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, Cesare's empire crumbled. He was too dependent on his father's money and his father's army, and he was not able to hold on to what he had conquered. He was eventually captured and imprisoned, and he died a few years later. His story is a classic example of how a man can rise to immense power and then lose it all in a single moment. It's a reminder that even in a world of ruthless ambition, luck and timing still play a huge role. The Borgia Papacy was a watershed moment in the history of the Church. It was a time of immense corruption and scandal, and it was a major factor in the rise of the Protestant Reformation. People were shocked by the Borgias' flagrant disregard for spiritual values, and they began to question the very authority of the Pope. The Borgias, however, were also great patrons of the arts. They hired the best artists and architects to build new churches and palaces in Rome, and they helped to turn the city into a center of Renaissance art and culture. So, in a strange way, the Borgias were both a major reason for the decline of the papacy and a major force in the Renaissance. They were a perfect example of the strange, beautiful, and often brutal world of medieval Italy, a world where the sacred and the profane were constantly intertwined. The papacy, for all its power and its corruption, was not to be the ultimate winner in the Italian wars. It was too busy playing its own games to see the bigger picture. And the bigger picture was a new and terrifying reality. The armies of France and Spain were not just passing through Italy anymore. They were there to stay, and they were about to bring a level of destruction that had not been seen in centuries. The ultimate and most shocking moment of that destruction was about to take place in the heart of Rome itself, a moment that would signal the end of an era. The Italian wars were a chaotic, brutal free-for-all, and the popes, for all their cunning, were just one player in a much bigger game. They had allied with the French, then the Spanish, then the French again, trying to play one great power against the other. In 1527, a new pope, Clement VII, made a fateful mistake. He allied himself with France against the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. This was a massive miscalculation. Charles V was the most powerful man in Europe, a ruler who controlled a huge empire that included Spain, the Netherlands, and a large chunk of Germany. He was not a man to be trifled with, and his army, which was made up of a mix of German Lutherans and Spanish Catholics, was a terrifying force. Charles V, furious with the Pope's betrayal, sent his army south to punish Rome. The army was led by a man named Charles III, Duke of Bourbon, but he was more of a figurehead. The real power lay with the soldiers themselves, a huge force of about 34,000 men, who were a mix of nationalities and religions. They were also mutinous and unpaid, and they were tired of fighting for an emperor who didn't pay them. They saw Rome as a prize, a city of immense wealth that was ripe for the taking. The Pope, for his part, was completely unprepared. He had no army to speak of, and the Romans, who were a notoriously unruly bunch, were not about to fight for him. The city was a sitting duck. The imperial army arrived at the gates of Rome on May 6th, 1527. The Duke of Bourbon was killed in the first few moments of the fighting, and the army, now without a clear leader, went completely out of control. What followed was a week-long orgy of violence, looting, and destruction. It was a nightmare. The soldiers, who were a mix of Protestant and Catholic, were not just looking for money. They were also looking to punish the city that they saw as the source of all the corruption and evil in the world. They sacked churches, they desecrated holy relics, and they held cardinals and bishops for ransom. The Pope himself was forced to flee to a fortress, the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was besieged for months. The sack of Rome was an act of brutal, indiscriminate violence, a crime against a city that was, in many ways, the cultural heart of Europe. The city's magnificent art, its beautiful churches, and its priceless libraries were all damaged or destroyed. It was a huge psychological blow, a wake-up call for the entire continent. The popes had been playing a game of power politics, and they had just lost in the most spectacular way possible. The sack of Rome was a major turning point. It signaled the end of the High Renaissance and the beginning of a new era of political domination. The Italian city-states, which had been so powerful for so long, were now revealed to be little more than pawns in a much bigger game. Their wealth, their art, and their independence were all at the mercy of foreign powers. The Emperor, Charles V, was now the undisputed master of Italy. The popes, who had been so arrogant and so powerful, were now at his mercy. They were forced to make a humiliating peace, and they would never again be able to command the same kind of political power they had in the past. The sack of Rome was a brutal, ugly end to a long and beautiful era. It was a clear sign that the world had changed forever. The age of the independent city-state was over, and a new age of foreign domination was about to begin. The final act of the medieval Italian drama was about to take place, a sad, slow wind down that would see the great independent city-states of Italy fade into memory and be replaced by something else entirely. The sun was setting on the medieval era, and the Italian people were left to pick up the pieces of a beautiful but broken dream. The sack of Rome was a devastating blow, but it didn't kill the Italian city-states instantly. It was more like a long, slow illness that led to a final, sad decline. The great independent republics of Italy had been exposed as little more than powerless pawns in a much bigger game, and the great foreign powers of Europe were now the ones calling the shots. The Treaty of Cato Compresi in 1559 officially ended the Italian wars, but it also formalized a new reality. Italy was now dominated by Spain. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily in the south, the Duchy of Milan in the north, and a series of smaller territories in between. The old, chaotic, and beautiful world of the independent city-state was gone forever. But the city-states didn't just disappear. They changed. Some, like Florence, which had been turned into a duchy, and later a Grand Duchy under the Medici family, managed to survive by becoming client states of the great powers. They lost their independence, but they kept their wealth and their cultural influence. They were a kind of protectorate, and they used their position to continue to patronize the arts and to maintain a semblance of their old glory. The Medici, who had gone from bankers to puppet masters to dukes, were now the masters of a formal state, a fact that would have no doubt baffled their ancestors. Their rule was more stable and centralized than the old republican government, but it was also less dynamic and less free. Other cities, like Siena, which had fought so hard to maintain its independence, were simply conquered. Siena was eventually absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, a sad end for a city that had once been the great rival of Florence. Pisa, as you may recall, had already been conquered by Florence in the previous century. The great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa were able to hold on to their independence for a bit longer, but they were also a shadow of their former selves. Their trade routes had been eclipsed by the new sea routes to the Americas and Asia, and their power was in a state of slow and irreversible decline. Venice, for example, would eventually become a kind of tourist attraction, a beautiful but politically irrelevant city. The old political structures, the Guelphs and Ghibellines, were now a thing of the past. The Holy Roman Emperors were still a presence, but they were no longer the powerful meddling figures they had been in the past. They were now more concerned with their German territories and with the Protestant Reformation. The popes were still a force, but they were now a power that was more concerned with the Counter-Reformation and with the spiritual and political health of the Catholic Church. They were no longer the power brokers who could crown and depose kings. They were now just another Italian prince, and a very cautious one at that. The legacy of the Italian city-states was, however, immense. They had created a new kind of society, one that was based on commerce, on civic pride, and on a new kind of humanism. They had created the Renaissance, a cultural and artistic explosion that would change the world forever. They had created a new kind of politics, one that was based on diplomacy, on alliances, and on a new kind of political ruthlessness. They had, in a sense, invented the modern state, and while their independence was now a thing of the past, their influence was still felt all over the world. The world of the city-state was over, and the world of the nation-state was beginning. It was a new era, and it would be a very different one. The Treaty of Cateau Cambrésis in 1559 might have formally ended the Italian wars, but it also cemented a new, grim reality. The era of the independent Italian city-state was over. Spain, now the preeminent power in Europe, had carved up the peninsula and claimed its best pieces. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled the wealthy Duchy of Milan in the north, the sprawling Kingdom of Naples and Sicily in the south, and a series of smaller territories known as the State of the Presidi. The popes, who had once been the great kingmakers of Europe, were now little more than cautious regional rulers, more concerned with their own survival and with the internal politics of the Papal States than with any grand imperial ambition. The old, chaotic, and beautiful world of the independent city-state was gone forever. But it didn't just vanish. It slowly dissolved. Like sugar in water, some cities, like Florence, which had been turned into a grand duchy under the Medici family, managed to survive by becoming a client state of Spain. They lost their political independence, but kept their immense wealth and their cultural influence. The Medici, who had gone from bankers to puppet masters to dukes, were now the masters of a formal state. Their rule was more stable and centralized than the old republican government, but it was also less dynamic and less free. Other cities were simply conquered. Siena, which had fought so hard to maintain its independence, was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, a sad end for a city that had once been a great rival of Florence. Pisa had already been conquered by Florence in the previous century. The great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa were able to hold on to their independence for a bit longer. But they were also a shadow of their former selves. Their trade routes had been eclipsed by the new sea routes to the Americas and Asia, and their power was in a state of slow and irreversible decline. Venice, for example, would eventually become a kind of tourist attraction, a beautiful but politically irrelevant city ruled by a decadent oligarchy. The old political structures of the Guelphs and Ghibellines were now a thing of the past. The Holy Roman Emperors were still a presence, but they were no longer the powerful meddling figures they had been in the past. They were now more concerned with their German territories and with the Protestant Reformation. The popes were still a force, but they were now a power that was more concerned with the Counter-Reformation and with the spiritual and political health of the Catholic Church. They were no longer the power brokers who could crown and depose kings. They were now just another Italian prince, and a very cautious one at that. The legacy of the Italian city-states was, however, immense. They had created a new kind of society, one that was based on commerce, on civic pride, and on a new kind of humanism. They had created the Renaissance, a cultural and artistic explosion that would change the world forever. They had created a new kind of politics, one that was based on diplomacy, on alliances, and on a new kind of political ruthlessness. They had, in a sense, invented the modern state, and while their independence was now a thing of the past, their influence was still felt all over the world. The world of the city-state was over, and the world of the nation-state was beginning. It was a new era, and it would be a very different one. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 formally ended the Italian wars, but it also formalized a new reality. Italy was now dominated by Spain. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily in the south, the Duchy of Milan in the north, and a series of smaller territories in between. The old, chaotic, and beautiful world of the independent city-state was gone forever. But it didn't just vanish. It slowly dissolved. Like sugar in water, some cities, like Florence, which had been turned into a grand duchy under the Medici family, managed to survive by becoming a client state of Spain. They lost their political independence, but kept their immense wealth and their cultural influence. The Medici, who had gone from bankers to puppet masters to dukes, were now the masters of a formal state. Their rule was more stable and centralized than the old republican government, but it was also less dynamic and less free. Other cities were simply conquered. Siena, which had fought so hard to maintain its independence, was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. A sad end for a city that had once been a great rival of Florence. Pisa had already been conquered by Florence in the previous century. The great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa were able to hold on to their independence for a bit longer, but they were also a shadow of their former selves. Their trade routes had been eclipsed by the new sea routes to the Americas and Asia, and their power was in a state of slow and irreversible decline. Venice, for example, would eventually become a kind of tourist attraction, a beautiful but politically irrelevant city. The old political structures of the Guelphs and Ghibellines were now a thing of the past. The Holy Roman Emperors were still a presence, but they were no longer the powerful, meddling figures they had been in the past. They were now more concerned with their German territories and with the Protestant Reformation. The popes were still a force, but they were now a power that was more concerned with the Counter-Reformation and with the spiritual and political health of the Catholic Church. They were no longer the power brokers who could crown and depose kings. They were now just another Italian prince, and a very cautious one at that. The legacy of the Italian city-states was, however, immense. They had created a new kind of society, one that was based on commerce, on civic pride, and on a new kind of humanism. They had created the Renaissance, a cultural and artistic explosion that would change the world forever. They had created a new kind of politics, one that was based on diplomacy, on alliances, and on a new kind of political ruthlessness. They had, in a sense, invented the modern state, and while their independence was now a thing of the past. Their influence was still felt all over the world. The world of the city-state was over, and the world of the nation-state was beginning. It was a new era, and it would be a very different one. The end of the Italian Wars and the establishment of Spanish hegemony brought a new, if not always welcome, kind of stability to the Italian peninsula. The constant wars between the city-states, the invasions, and the endless political intrigue gave way to a long period of foreign rule. But while the political map was settled, the intellectual and artistic currents that had been unleashed by the Renaissance continued to flow. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, was now in full swing, and it had a huge impact on Italy. The popes, chastened by the sack of Rome and the rise of Protestantism, were now focused on reforming the church and on re-establishing their moral and spiritual authority. This meant a new kind of artistic patronage, one that was more focused on religious themes and on the kind of dramatic, emotional art that would inspire devotion in the faithful. This was the birth of the Baroque style, a style of art and architecture that was all about grandeur, drama, and emotion. It was, in a sense, the artistic manifestation of the Church's renewed confidence. But the long period of Spanish rule also had a dark side. The Spanish, for all their power, were not good rulers. They imposed heavy taxes. They were not interested in investing in the local economy, and they were often absentee landlords, ruling through viceroys and governors who were more interested in lining their own pockets than in governing well. This led to a period of economic decline in many parts of the peninsula. The once great cities of Naples and Milan, which had been so rich and powerful, were now in a state of slow decay. The Spanish also brought with them the Spanish Inquisition, a brutal institution that was used to enforce religious orthodoxy and to root out heresy. It was a far cry from the freewheeling, humanistic culture of the Renaissance. The intellectuals, the artists, and the scientists who had once been so celebrated were now living in a world where they had to be careful about what they said and what they wrote. But even under Spanish rule, the Italian spirit of innovation and rebellion was not completely extinguished. A new kind of ruler, the Dukes of Savoy, was quietly building a new kind of state in the northwest of Italy. They were not a major power, but they were shrewd, ambitious, and they were experts at playing the great powers off against each other. They were a military dynasty, and they were slowly but surely expanding their territory, taking advantage of the constant wars between France and Spain. They were a new kind of player in the Italian game, a military state that was focused on a new kind of ambition, the ambition of a unified Italy. This was a long way off, of course, but the seeds of it were sown in this period of Spanish domination. The Dukes of Savoy would become the great unifiers of Italy, and their capital, Turin, would become a new kind of Italian city, a military and political center that was a far cry from the artistic and commercial centers of the past. The stage was set for a new kind of drama, one that would see the old, beautiful, and chaotic world of the city-state give way to a new kind of Italy, one that was united, but perhaps a little less beautiful. The long period of Spanish domination had a profound and lasting impact on the Italian peninsula, but it was not a time of total stasis. Below the surface of political stagnation, the intellectual and scientific currents of the Renaissance were still at work, albeit in a more cautious environment. The great astronomer and physicist Galileo Galilei, for example, did most of his groundbreaking work during this period. But he was forced to recant his ideas by the Inquisition. His story is a powerful symbol of the new reality in Italy, a place of immense genius, but also a place where that genius was often held in check by religious and political authorities. The popes, meanwhile, were no longer the corrupt, worldly figures of the Borgia era. They were now reformers, men who were dedicated to the spiritual and political health of the church. This was the era of great popes like Sixtus V, who was a master of administration and a man who was determined to turn Rome into a truly magnificent city. He rebuilt aqueducts, straightened streets, and built new churches and palaces. He was, in a sense, the great urban planner of his time. He was a ruthless ruler, but he was also a man who was dedicated to the greater good of his city and his church. But even with the new stability, Italy was not immune to the great wars that were now engulfing the rest of Europe. The 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, for example, had a huge impact on the Italian states, as they were often a battleground for the armies of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The war, which was fought between Protestant and Catholic states, was a devastating conflict that left much of Central Europe in ruins. While Italy was spared the worst of the fighting, it was still a major player in the diplomatic and military maneuvering that went on. The Dukes of Savoy, for example, became masters of this new kind of warfare, using their shrewd diplomacy and their strong military to expand their territory and to play the great powers off against each other. They were a new kind of state, a military monarchy that was focused on a new kind of ambition, the ambition of a unified Italy. This was a long way off, of course, but the seeds of it were sown in this period of Spanish domination. The Italian economy, meanwhile, was in a state of slow decline. The old trading empires of Venice and Genoa were now a thing of the past. The great discoveries of the New World had shifted the center of world trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, and the Italian cities were no longer at the center of the action. The once great port cities were now little more than backwaters, and the great banking families of Florence and Siena were no longer the financial heart of Europe. The Spanish, who ruled over much of Italy, were not interested in investing in the local economy, and they imposed heavy taxes that stifled growth. It was a long, slow period of decay, a sad end for a region that had once been the most dynamic and innovative in all of Europe. But even in this period of decline, there was a new kind of art and a new kind of spirit. The Baroque artists, with their dramatic and emotional works, were a reflection of a new kind of faith, a faith that was more focused on emotion and on personal piety. The great Baroque architects, with their grand and sweeping designs, were a reflection of a new kind of power, a power that was more focused on religious authority and on the grandeur of the church. It was a different kind of world, a world that was a far cry from the bright, humanistic world of the Renaissance. But it was a world that still had a kind of beauty all its own. The 17th and 18th centuries in Italy were, in many ways, a long, slow wind down, a final, sad chapter in the story of a once great civilization. The great independent city-states were gone, and the peninsula was a patchwork of foreign-dominated territories and a few small, cautious, and politically irrelevant independent states. The Spanish, who had ruled over much of Italy for over a century, were now a fading power, and their place was being taken by a new set of players, the Austrian Habsburgs and the French Bourbons. The great powers of Europe were now fighting for control of Italy, and the Italian people were little more than passive bystanders, watching as their land was used as a battlefield for foreign wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, and the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740-1748, were particularly devastating for Italy, as the French, Spanish, and Austrian armies fought a series of long, bloody, and pointless wars on Italian soil. The political map of Italy was constantly being redrawn, with territories being traded back and forth like a deck of cards. The old, chaotic, and beautiful world of the city-state was gone, replaced by a new, more boring and more static kind of politics. But even in this period of decline, there were still a few signs of life. The papacy, which had been so politically powerful in the past, was now a much more spiritual institution. The popes were no longer the great power brokers of Europe. They were now the spiritual leaders of the Catholic world, and they were more focused on the internal politics of the Church than on the great wars of Europe. This was a good thing for the Italian people, as it meant that the popes were no longer a major source of political instability. The popes were now focused on the great works of the Counter-Reformation, and they were turning Rome into a truly magnificent city. The great Baroque artists and architects were at work, and the city was being transformed into a true work of art. The popes were still rulers, of course, but they were a different kind of ruler. A ruler who was more focused on beauty and on spiritual authority than on military power. The great scientific and philosophical movements of the Enlightenment were also making their way into Italy, but they were often met with resistance from the religious and political authorities. The great Italian thinkers of the period, like Vico and Beccaria, were often forced to work in secret or to publish their works in other countries. The once great universities of Italy were now a shadow of their former selves, and the great intellectual life of the Renaissance was now a thing of the past. But even with all the stagnation and all the foreign domination, there was still a sense of a shared Italian identity. The great works of literature, art, and music that had been created in the past were a shared cultural heritage, a reminder that the Italian people were a single, unified people, even if they were not a single, unified state. The stage was set for a new kind of drama, one that would see the Italian people, for the first time in centuries, rise up and try to create a single, unified nation. But that story would have to wait for another century. The long, slow decline of the Italian peninsula came to an abrupt, shocking end in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the arrival of a new and terrifying force, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a French general who was determined to change the political map of Europe. And Italy was the first place he set his sights on. He led a series of lightning-fast military campaigns into Italy, easily defeating the armies of Austria and the other European powers. He was, in a sense, a new kind of ruler, a man who was not a king or an emperor, but a military genius who was determined to remake the world in his own image. He abolished the old feudal states of Italy, and he created a series of new, modern republics. He was, in a sense, a liberator, a man who had freed the Italian people from the yoke of foreign domination. But he was also a tyrant, a man who ruled with an iron fist, and who was more interested in the glory of France than in the well-being of the Italian people. The arrival of Napoleon was a turning point. It signaled the end of the old medieval world of Italy and the beginning of a new, modern world. The old, fragmented, and beautiful world of the city-state was gone forever, replaced by a new, more centralized, and more uniform kind of state. The old political structures, the old dynasties, and the old ways of doing things were all swept away by the storm of the French Revolution. The Italian people, for the first time in centuries, were faced with a new reality. They were now part of a new, unified state. They were no longer just Florentines or Venetians. They were Italians. This was a new and very powerful idea, an idea that would become the driving force behind the unification of Italy in the 19th century, the story of medieval Italy, the story of 1,000 different cities and 1,000 different rulers had come to an end, and a new story, the story of a single, unified nation, was about to begin. The legacy of the Italian Middle Ages is, however, immense. It was a period of immense change, of immense creativity, and of immense violence. It was a period that saw the birth of the modern state, the birth of the Renaissance, and the birth of a new kind of humanism. It was a period that saw the rise and fall of great empires, the rise and fall of great cities, and the rise and fall of great men. It was a period that was, in a sense, a microcosm of the entire human experience. And now, as the story comes to an end, all that is left is the whisper of a dream of a world that was, of a world that could have been, and of a world that, in some ways, still is. The sun was setting on the medieval era, and the Italian people were left to pick up the pieces of a broken dream. The era of the independent city-state was over, and a new era of foreign domination was about to begin. The great independent city-states of Italy, which had been so powerful for so long, were now revealed to be little more than powerless pawns in a much bigger game. The great foreign powers of Europe, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were now the ones calling the shots, and they would continue to dominate the peninsula for centuries to come. But the story of medieval Italy doesn't end with a whimper. It ends with a whisper. A whisper of a dream that was never fully realized. A dream of a united, free, and independent Italy. It was a dream that would have to wait for another 300 years to come to pass. A dream that would have to wait for a new kind of leader, a new kind of idea, and a new kind of world. But the seeds of that dream were sown in the long, chaotic, and beautiful story of medieval Italy. They were sown in the struggles between the popes and the emperors, in the rivalries between the cities, in the art of the Renaissance, and in the ambition of the great princes and despots. The Italian people, for all their faults, had shown the world a new way of living, a new way of thinking, and a new way of being. They had shown the world that a state could be a city, that a city could be a work of art, and that a man, no matter his background, could be the master of his own destiny. And so, as you drift off to sleep, let the whispers of that dream carry you. Let the echoes of the great battles, the great conspiracies, and the great works of art fill your mind. Remember the names of the great condottieri, the ruthless popes, and the magnificent princes. Remember the names of the great cities, the ones that rose to glory, and the ones that fell to ruin. Remember them all. They are all a part of a long, beautiful, and often brutal story. And now, that story is done. The sun has set. The day is over. The great play has come to an end. And all that is left is the whisper of a dream. So, close your eyes and let the whispers carry you away.